So I'd intended to have my review of the first episode of Class up by now, but of course things like life had to get in the way of that. And even though I'm still jonesing to get that video uploaded, there's no way I'm holding off on talking about this movie for the sake of that pile of Slovene feces. Dr. Stephen Strange is a neurosurgeon the likes of which you've never seen. His insane level of competence predictably leads to a massive ego, but he ends up taking himself down a peg by texting and driving like a moron. Luckily he survives, but unluckily he does so with crushed hands. After many a failed attempt to get his hands back in working order, the Doc finds himself in Kathmandu, where a strange woman called the Ancient One manages to tune him into the idea of using magic to fix his problems. Of course, an adversary happens to make itself known just as this happens, in the form of the Ancient One's former student turned zealot named Caecilius. Now Doctor Strange has to grow not only as a sorcerer, but as a person in order to take on this new threat. I don't understand how Marvel does this. I just don't. I mean, I think all of these movies, barring two of them, are resoundingly good films, but ever since the release of Captain America the Winter Soldier over 2 years ago, the MCU has gone from making consistently good movies to consistently spectacular ones. Guardians of the Galaxy just makes me smile endlessly. Avengers Age of Ultron is one of my all-time favorite films. Ant-Man is a bit of an exception, and Civil War and The Winter Soldier itself are, I think, the kind of masterful storytelling that validate this entire genre, much like The Dark Knight did back in 2008. And now Doctor Strange joins those films as easily one of my top 5 of the MCU. Like Guardians of the Galaxy, there may be one or two elements of it that sour on me with time, but having only seen it once, I think it's a franchise highlight. Frankly, after hearing that a lot of people were split in regards to just how good it was, I'm actually quite glad that I went into the movie prepared for something enjoyable but generic, because I'm honestly blown away by how good I thought it was. I feel almost bad about hyping this thing up, since it guarantees you walking into the theater asking for more than I did. Almost! Getting what everyone wants to talk about out of the way early, the effects are spectacular. The imagery is perhaps not as reminiscent of a drug trip as you might have hoped or expected going in, but it is bloody impressive regardless. The action is just lovely, and the way the action is spaced out is actually noteworthy as well. Almost all of it is in the second act, and while the third act does have a notable bit of action, playing on our expectations of how we expect a superhero movie to end, the story's real climax doesn't come down to fists or lasers at all, and I love it for that. It's really in that second act, once Strange and Caecilius meet for the first time, that this movie really becomes one of my favorites. There's a bit of a lull in the pacing in the immediately preceding scene, and I was starting to get worried that this may be one of those movies where I'm tempted to occasionally zone out. But the action and the dialogue, especially from that scene onward, is just so good. Much like Age of Ultron, this is a movie where I can recognize where people's criticisms are coming from, even though I firmly don't share them. People call Caecilius another weak villain. I think he was pretty okay. He's not as good as Ultron or Loki or Zemo or even really the likes of Red Skull or Alexander Pierce, but he's got a motivation I find really interesting. And while I'd have given him perhaps more scenes to shine in, the ones he gets between the Ancient One and Strange himself are really good, and you can see why they hired Mads Mikkelsen for those bits of gold. There's also been some criticism of the love interest Christine, played by Rachel McAdams, saying she should have been in more of the film, but I think she was implemented perfectly. She only really has 4 big scenes, but she does justice to all of them, and I like that even with such relatively little time on screen, I feel I've got a pretty good read on her character with just one viewing. I certainly wouldn't call her superfluous, since her relationship with Strange is constantly informing his character, even in scenes where she's not present. Still, though, the obvious MVP of this film is the main character. It's inevitable to see comparisons between Stephen Strange and Robert Downey Jr.'s Tony Stark, and while the two are absolutely similar, I think they're also different in key ways. There's a lot of anger and indignation and desperation in Strange's early scenes, for example, and in the later ones there's a lot of silent consideration for the moral grayness inherent to this movie's conflict. And through it all, there's a root to his ego that's different from Stark's. It really is a role with a lot to dig into, and Benedict Cumberbatch delivers on that promise perfectly. And yes, that includes his American accent. That's something else I'd heard mixed things about, but honestly, you could trick me into thinking that's his natural voice, and never once did I hear or see Sherlock or Khan in his performance. At this point, I should just stop being even remotely concerned that Marvel would ever miscast a leading role or fail to make them entirely compelling. And just like so many characters before him, this studio has made me fall in love with a protagonist I never cared for on the comic page. Something that helps this, and one of the few things I think Marvel Studios doesn't really get that much credit for, is that they don't make their origin stories an exercise in waiting for characters to become the characters. Iron Man, Captain America, the Guardians of the Galaxy, and now Doctor Strange all feel like fully formed versions of themselves by at least the midway point of their first films. And while I was a bit skeptical of going down the origin route again, I'm ultimately glad that we did, because there's a real story here beyond Stephen getting superpowers. A story about surrendering to time, the point of time, as well as that of life and death and the sanctity of all three. All of the movie's best character moments come from these ideas, in particular just why the title of Doctor means so much to Doctor Strange. The other main characters play just as much into these themes as Strange does, however, in particular Caecilius, but also the Ancient One played by Tilda Swinton and Mordo played by Chiwetel Ejiofor. These are all characters who have to confront the idea of the passage of time and moving on from a phase in their lives the same way Strange does, and together their disparate choices in the matter make up the movie's thesis. The relationship between Mordo and the Ancient One in particular, and where it ultimately leads the former, is debatably a tragic one. For as good as the dialogue is for all of these characters, I think the movie's most effective moments are the silent ones. The ones where the direction and the visuals and the performances really key you into what the movie's trying to say. Add all of that together with Marvel's typical A-plus brand of humor, especially from characters like Wong, played by Benedict Wong, which thankfully almost always lands and never manages to undercut the drama, and I think Doctor Strange is honestly a special movie. I did not expect to come out of this movie debating in my head whether or not I liked it more than Captain America Civil War. There was a lot of things about it that could work against it in my mind, but the fact that it overcame all of them and turned them on their head into massive strengths is something that I honestly have to applaud. I almost feel like I'm not doing it justice with a review this short, but I don't want to spoil any of it, and I think that you should definitely go watch it for yourself. Do it! Do it now! Do it!